Well, hello, everybody. Mr. Pippin has joined me here. Welcome to Sunday Morning Coffee with Dr. Childress. So in this particular video, I'm going to be discussing the diagnosis of a factitious disorder imposed on another. That's among the diagnoses that are appropriate for this family court pathology. Shared persecutory delusion, factitious disorder imposed on another, child psychological abuse, spousal abuse of the targeted parent by the allied parent using the child as a weapon. So there's your four diagnoses of concern. But today I want to talk about the factitious disorder because that's one of the, if not the central feature. It's tough to make a call between whether it's primarily a persecutory delusion, shared, induced, or whether it's a factitious disorder imposed on the child, because persecutory delusion is imposed on the child, and the factitious disorder is the persecutory delusion. So it's kind of one thing, but you can parse it out a little bit into its various component diagnoses. So, starting with the definition of a factitious disorder imposed on another. Classically, that's called Munchausen by proxy. And the definition of a factitious disorder is a false pathology created in the child for secondary gain or reward to the pathological parent. So if you Google factitious, that's an artificially created or developed pathology. So it's an artificially created attachment pathology. And typically for a Munchausen diagnosis or factitious disorder, that's thought of as creating a medical problem for secondary gain. Whereas in this situation, we got creating a psychological, developmental, even psychiatric pathology. So it's not a medical pathology that's being induced. It's a psychological, psychiatric pathology, developmental pathology as well. And so it's a different category, but it's the same dynamic, it's the same pathology on this. And in the medical field of diagnosing factitious disorders, typically, oftentimes, where that is diagnosed is children's hospitals, because a lot of times it's around allergy kind of things or strange neurological features. And so within the community, doctors, they can't quite figure out what it is, or because it's a false symptom display. And so they keep trying things and they keep guessing and nothing's showing up. And it keeps moving up the medical food chain of expertise until it reaches a children's hospital, which is typically at the top. And when a physician at children's hospital becomes suspicious of FDIA, factitious disorder imposed on another, oftentimes because the chart is like really huge, when they get the medical record from years, there's a huge chart with no specific diagnosis. We can't figure out what is going on here. And that's your first clue. We may have a factitious disorder. And so they will they'll have the nurse call down to the psych department. And they'll say, we want a psych consult for FDIA. The psych department will send up a pediatric psychologist, like me, to make the diagnosis of FDIA. Now, to make that diagnosis, I need the physicians to tell me there is no medical cause for this. Okay, I'm not a physician, but the moment the physicians say there's no medical cause, then as a psychologist, I can say this is a factitious disorder imposed on another because I've got all the other signs and symptoms of FDIA if it's a false pathology. Okay, so that's a critical thing. It is a diagnosis by rule out. We diagnose ADHD by something being there. We diagnose autism by something being there. We diagnose eating disorders by something being there. We diagnose a factitious disorder by something not being there. There's no real disorder there. It's a diagnosis by rule out. So in this case, if the possible pathology is authentic pathology, would be child abuse by the targeted parent, creating the child's desire to flee that parent, abusive range parent. So if we rule that out as the cause, there's no child abuse by the targeted parent, then we have a factitious attachment pathology being imposed on the child, and that opens up the next domain. So that's your first step. Is it a true pathology or a false pathology? Which parent is abusing the child? You start by ruling out the targeted parent on that. So here is the ICD-11 description for the diagnosis 6051 of factitious disorder imposed on another. Now, I used the ICD-10 diagnostic system here as opposed to DSM-5. They're very much in line with each other. The DSM-5 is from the American Psychiatric Association, often has more fulsome discussions of each of the categories or each of the diagnostic pathologies, whereas the ICD-10 system is from the World Health Organization, and it lists code numbers for all medical and all psychiatric disorders. So it's used for billing purposes, for insurance, or for documentation purposes. So when you make a diagnosis as a doctor, you put the ICD code on, and it goes into, and that qualifies it for insurance reimbursement, the diagnosis. So that's what the ICD-11 is a list of all medical and all psychiatric disorders given a code number. So the code for FDIA, ICD-11, is 6D51. For the DSM-5, it's 300.19. And here's what the World Health Organization, ICD-11, describes is a factitious disorder. Factitious disorder imposed on another is characterized by feigning, falsifying, or inducing medical, psychological, or behavioral signs and symptoms or injury in another person, most commonly a child dependent, associated with identified deception. Okay, so that's the definition of it. So what we have here is a false, factitious attachment pathology. The allied parent is creating a false, factitious, artificially created attachment pathology in the child. That is a psychological and developmental pathology. So that qualifies under the category. It's a psychological, but it's also developmental. It's like your attachment system. The parent's destroying the child's attachment system that's going to have long-term effects, negative effects on the child. And they're doing it for secondary gain or reward to the allied narcissistic-borderline-dark personality parent. Now, notice in the diagnostic descriptions, secondary gain to the parent is not part of the diagnostic criteria. It's just creating the false pathology in the child. Now, I keep adding secondary gain to this because I'm kind of old school. I come out of Children's Hospital. I come out of the old ways of diagnosing FDIA, and that was a criteria. It was both producing the false pathology for secondary gain to the parent. So you had to identify both components of that to make the diagnosis. But the DSM they don't like diagnosing motivations. They don't want to stay on symptoms, not the motivations behind those symptoms. So they removed that secondary gain qualifier to the diagnosis. So now it's just inducing false pathology in the child. But I kind of still like the secondary gain. I like to identify it because I think it gives us a fulsome look and confidence in the FDIA diagnosis. So, but that's also, I want to point out, there's two factitious disorders that we could identify in this, because one is the false attachment pathology, which is a psychological developmental pathology. The second, though, is a false delusional disorder. The child has this fixed and false belief that they're being malevolently treated in some way. So the allied parent is creating a false, factitious, artificially created persecutory delusion in the child, a false belief the child's being malevolently treated in some way by the targeted parent. That is a psychiatric pathology. So I've got and psychiatric is a medical zone. So that I've got a psychological and a psychiatric pathology related, both being produced in the child for secondary gain reward to the allied narcissistic borderline dark personality parent. So I'm clearly in the FDIA diagnostic category with this. And let me talk about diagnosis for a second. Diagnosis is a pattern match of the symptoms to the diagnostic criteria. So do these symptoms match the diagnostic criteria? And when they line up, well, there's your diagnosis because you match. And so if you match the diagnostic criteria for schizophrenia, guess what? You got schizophrenia, whether you like it or not, because you're pattern matching to the diagnosis. So we have a pattern match here, the factitious disorder imposed on the child. And they even say it's most likely on the child. Yep, that's what we're looking at. And then we got other descriptions out of the DSM-5, the American Psychiatric Association, and also match up well here. So the potential secondary gain to the allied parent. Now, that's not part of the diagnostic category, but I like to have that understanding. And in this case, the secondary gain is absolutely clear. It's possible manipulation of the court regarding its decisions regarding child custody, absolutely right up front. And let me tell you something about a factitious disorder. If you are going to reward the parent for creating pathology in the child, guess what? The pathological parent is going to create pathology in the child because you are rewarding it. So if their goal in producing pathology in the child, false pathology, is to manipulate the court's decisions on child custody, and it is successful, then guess what? You're going to have a lot of parents in the family courts producing severe, destructive, abusive pathology in their children because you are rewarding it by giving them custody of that child when they do that. So I would strongly recommend you stop rewarding pathological, dark personality parents for creating pathology in their child and abusing their child. Stop rewarding that. But right now they're getting rewarded for that, so they're doing it. So that's just one of the secondary gains. The second secondary gain and the driving motivation of the parent is the spousal psychological abuse of the targeted parent using the child and the child's induced pathology as a spousal abuse weapon. So we have fundamentally a spousal abuse pathology using the child as the spousal abuse weapon, and in weaponizing the child to use the child as a weapon, they create such pathology in the child, it becomes child psychological abuse as well. So we have two dangerous pathologies. There's a cat's a category. There's the type of dangerous pathologies are suicide, homicide, and abuse, child abuse, spousal abuse, and elder abuse. Any one of those activate duty to protect obligations in the doctors. We have two possible dangerous pathologies, possible child abuse and possible spousal abuse. And we got allegations from the allied parent and the child's symptoms of possible child abuse by the targeted parent. So we are so into the dangerous pathology zone. So we should be always doing a risk assessment for the various dangerous pathologies of concern. One of them is spousal abuse of the targeted parent using the child as a weapon. Is that happening? No, it's not. So the third secondary gain, so we got three potential secondary gains, all substantial. The third one is to meet the pathological parent's own emotional and psychological needs. And so here we have a narcissistic need to be the all-wonderful parent, and you're the rejected parent. I'm the all-wonderful one. So you got that narcissistic need going on. You got the borderlines need, fear of abandonment. Oh, you know what? The kids belong to me, and you can go away, kind of stuff with the borderline. So they're meeting their own needs to use the child as a regulatory object to stabilize the pathological parent's own stuff. So boom, boom, boom. I got three secondary gains, potentially three rewards that the parent is receiving, the pathological parent is receiving from producing severe pathology in their child. So returning again to the ICD-10 or ICD-11 diagnosis here, it says, this is what they say, World Health Organization, ICD-11, the individual seeks treatment for the other person or otherwise presents him or her as ill, injured, or impaired based on feigned, falsified, or induced signs and symptoms or injuries. Now, remember that, just the prior quote from them said it's often produced in the dependent child. And so here they're saying that the allied parent is now presenting that child as either being impaired or ill, or it's for treatment of their induced signs or symptoms, which is exactly what's going on. The allied parent produces symptoms in the child and then presents the child out and says, "Oh, look at the child's symptoms. They need treatment, or they need a response to do something because of the child's symptoms." That's exactly it. They're doing that and then presenting the child out to manipulate other people. We have the criteria for factitious disorder imposed on another are met. And if you pattern match, if you meet the diagnostic criteria, that's your pathology. So we meet diagnostic criteria of FDIA. And so here we have what's happening in the family courts. The allied parent presents the child as impaired based on the child's induced signs and symptoms. There you go. It's FDIA. It's a factitious disorder imposed on the child for secondary gain to a narcissistic borderline-dark personality parent, which is also child psychological abuse. So here's your differential diagnosis. In all of these families, if you have court-involved custody conflict with severe attachment pathology, a child rejecting a parent, this is your differential diagnosis. You have two litigants, both are making counter accusations. We need to figure out which is going on. Is the targeted parent physically, sexually, neglectfully, or psychologically abusing the child? That's your first rule out. Is there authentic abuse? If there is not authentic abuse, then you look to the allied parent. Is there a shared persecutory delusion? Is it a factitious attachment pathology imposed on the child? Is it child psychological abuse? And is it spousal abuse using the child as a weapon? All of those diagnoses warrant a proper risk assessment for both halves of that situation surrounding the child. So, all mental health evaluations of court-involved family custody conflict involving severe attachment pathology, a child rejecting a parent, should receive a proper risk assessment for child abuse to the appropriate differential diagnoses for each parent. All of them. Mental health reports that are submitted to the court, all mental health reports to the court should discuss the rule-out diagnoses for the following: for the possible persecutory delusion in the family, for the possible factitious attachment pathology imposed on the child by the allied parent, for the possible psychological abuse of the child by the allied parent, and for the possible spousal psychological abuse of the targeted parent by the allied parent. The mental health report to the court should include a discussion of these diagnostic possibilities and the reasons for their either being diagnosed or ruled out. This is so fundamental to psychological practice and diagnosis and report writing, and it's not followed by any of the forensic people in the family courts. And so it is substantially substandard professional practice in their reports. And for the legal professionals, attorneys and judges, to understand what you should be getting from the doctors is the same thing the judges provide when they make their diagnosis or their court finding of fact or their verdict in the situation or their decision. When the court decides on some legal issue, when they render their decision, they elaborate on what the legal statutes were, what the considerations were relative to those legal statutes, and then also explain how the reasoning for how those were applied to the evidence to reach the verdict or decision that the court reached. So all of that is explained, because if it's appealed for a second opinion to the appellate court's going to want to know the judge's reasoning. What laws did you apply? How did you apply them? And what decisions did you make? And that should be a clear description by the judge to the appellate court as to how that decision was made. In healthcare system, it's the same thing for the doctors. There might be a second opinion review of your diagnosis, questioning your diagnosis as being a possible misdiagnosis. So in your report, you should present the diagnostic considerations that are involved, the evidence, the symptom evidence related to those and their consideration, and then the reasoning for why you arrived at the diagnosis you did, one way or the other. So it should be exactly the same as what the legal system does for their second opinion, what the doctors do for their second opinion. Okay, it should be clearly explained. It's not. Okay, so that's a substantial problem in professional psychology that needs to be improved. All mental health reports to the court should include a discussion of these diagnostic possibilities and the reasons for their either being diagnosed or ruled out. It should be clear. I considered both litigants' concerns at a professional level, and this is the reasons based on the symptoms that I made my decisions that I did. There are two litigants. Both litigants have their concerns. The concerns of both litigants should be properly addressed by the doctors in the mental health system. The symptoms of a FDIA. Let me talk about how you diagnose FDIA. Because I'm a pediatric psychologist trained at Children's Hospital. I know how to diagnose FDIA. So how do we diagnose it? One of the key symptoms about their diagnosis of FDIA is there is no there. That's characteristic of the pathology. ADHD, there's something there. Autism, there's something there. Eating disorders, there's something there. Those are all real pathologies. A factitious disorder, when you go to find where it is, there's no there. It's because it's a false pathology. And so it's vaporous if you go in and look at it. So what the characteristic features are, first off, is you're going to have vague symptoms that don't fully make sense. They're not fitting quite right into anything. Now, if you just allow that as a doctor, like the community doctors on medical FDIA, they get these vague symptoms and they start doing their testing, but they allow the vague symptom, and so nothing gets clarified. It's always this vague domain until we reach the upper levels, and the physician goes, "Wait a minute, this is too vague." And they start honing in on specifically what is going on, and they're finding nothing there specifically. Then they call down to the psych department and get a consult on FDIA. So there are vague symptoms and the general descriptions of the symptoms. I'm traumatized by my dad because he yelled at me. Wait a minute, what's the trauma? Or they get specific. And that's important for all mental health professionals who are diagnosing potential FDIA. Be specific in your symptom collection, because that's critical. Because the FDIA, when you get specific, you will find no there. Okay, so that's really, really important as your professional standard of practice, that when you're considering FDIA and the person says any symptom, they got angry, and that's for psychologists, an applied behavioral analysis. Child says, there was this situation happened. Okay, let's do an applied behavioral analysis. What happened before, what happened during, what happened after, thinking, feeling, doing, behavior chain interview, put it together of what happened in that situation. Because if it's FDIA, you'll find there's no provocation. There was no child abuse. There was no situation. There's a false pathology there. If it's a true pathology, then that'll show up. Yeah, the parent was doing things that were problematic. Okay, so one way or the other, get specific on this. Yeah, let me give you an example of the nightmare stuff in psychology right now, of the failure to be specific. I see sometimes the involved mental health professional will give a factitious diagnosis of PTSD. It's a false PTSD. And the reason it's a false PTSD is because criteria A, the very first criterion for a post-traumatic stress disorder, describes the trauma needed to create PTSD symptoms. Okay, let me be really clear on this. If this caliber of trauma did not affect the brain, then there can be no PTSD symptoms. There can be a lot of effects. There can be, oh my God, it was very distressing. You can have a lot of emotional stuff. But the creation of post-traumatic stress disorder requires this pop to the brain that the brain then can't get out of. So it's exposure to, let's go through the criteria. PTSD criteria A for PTSD is exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. So the question becomes, what exposure to death, serious injury, or sexual violence occurred to the child to create the PTSD symptoms? There is none. Well, then there's no PTSD. I would then suggest that if the mental health person diagnosed the child with PTSD, when the child doesn't even meet the first criteria of ADHD, did they even bother to look in the DSM for what to match up the criteria? They're just lazy. They're just lazy and imprecise. And that's going to get you into so much trouble on FDIA if you are imprecise, if you don't suspect it's a factitious disorder and you just kind of saying, oh, because then guess what? That pathological parent and the child's induced symptoms manipulated you, the psychology person, into making a false, factitious misdiagnosis of the pathology because you're practicing beyond the boundaries of your competence with delusional thought disorders and factitious disorders and everything else. So you've become the mental health person, the mental health person who's misdiagnosed this as false PTSD, have become a participating child abuser by validating that the child was traumatized when they weren't. And so you're validating this false belief, the factitious disorder. So you become part of the factitious disorder created in the child. So you become a child abuser as a mental health professional and should lose your license as a result. And you become a spousal abuser of the targeted parent by saying they abuse their child in trauma when that's not true. So you're probably defaming them in the public documents and public statements that they actually abuse their child because you failed to do a proper assessment and diagnose the factitious disorder and shared delusion. So potentially you could face defamation lawsuits from the targeted parent because of your malpractice and negligence in the situation. So if you're going to diagnose PTSD, identify, just like going back to the court, how the court does their, on their reports and their verdict, the reasons, the legal statutes and why they applied them and how, and then you should do the same thing. On factitious disorder imposed on another, or PTSD, tell us why it's not a false trauma, a factitious trauma imposed on the child, if child's being presented as having a false trauma disorder, versus why it is authentic PTSD by the targeted parent. What was the exposure to death, serious injury, or sexual violence? That should be clear in your report, and you should be clearly considering those two possibilities. If you're not, then boundaries of competence issues come up, and if you misdiagnose it because you're practicing beyond the boundaries of your competence and wind up being part of the child abuse and spousal abuse, I think you should lose your license. Somebody's going to have to explain to me why a child abusing mental health professional, because they're just lazy and incompetent, should not lose their license to practice. Explain that to me, because if you're a child abuser as a mental health professional, I don't think you should have a license. So with that, I'm going to wrap up my talk today and move off onto my Sunday here and discuss some other aspect of the pathology with you next week. A critical issue was we need to get competent mental health services in the family courts, and right now they are abysmal. And the mental health people really, really need to up their game and return to just basic ethical standards of the APA 2.01, 2.04, 9.01. Start with those. 3.04, do no harm. We're not custody. We shouldn't be deciding on custody. Somebody's going to get hurt on that. We should be diagnosing and treating pathology. That's what doctors do. The courts decide on custody. No matter what custody situation gets decided, somebody's going to get hurt. One parent, the other parent, somebody's not going to get what they're. Somebody's going to have their situation. Somebody's going to get hurt. Doctors do no harm. We don't do that. So we don't decide which parent gets custody. That's a court's decision. Court can figure that out. What doctors do is diagnose and treat pathology. That's what we need to get back to. And the concern over in the family courts, the pathology of concerns, is a shared persecutory delusion and factitious disorder imposed on another. The two dangerous pathologies in the family courts are child abuse, either by the targeted parent, authentic attachment pathology, or by the allied parent, a factitious attachment pathology, and possible spousal abuse of the targeted parent using the child as a weapon. And there might be some allegations from the allied parent that the other parent was spousally abusive, and so we might have that in the mix as well. That's two dangerous pathologies, activates duty to protect obligations for all mental health professionals. So in all cases of child custody conflict surrounding severe attachment pathology, we should be conducting a proper risk assessment for child abuse to the appropriate differential diagnoses for each parent, all of these cases. And so with that, I'm going to head off to my Sunday and check in with you next week on some other aspect of a pathology.